Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal Brown talks to three reporters about the role that immigration played in the recent presidential and congressional elections. Theresa is joined by Myah Ward from Politico, Priscilla Alvarez from CNN, and Marianne LeVine from The Washington Post. They discuss how immigration featured in the various campaigns, how pivotal immigration was in determining the election results, and how this compares to previous elections. Stay tuned.
And we're back. The recent presidential and congressional campaigns saw Donald Trump win the presidency and the Republican Party win narrow majorities in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Immigration was a prominent issue in the campaigns, with Donald Trump and many Republican candidates emphasizing the border crisis that he charged emerged under the Democrats' watch and pledging to deport millions of immigrants. Even many Democrats started talking about securing the border, including some who won in the same districts Trump won. But just how important was immigration as an issue in the election, and how does this compare to previous elections? To discuss these issues, we welcome three great reporters who follow these issues closely. First, we welcome Myah Ward, who is the White House reporter from Politico. Myah previously worked as a breaking news reporter, a senior digital producer, and an editorial intern at Politico. Before joining the newsroom, Myah interned for the Charlotte Observer, Bloomberg, and freelanced for the New York Times. So welcome to the podcast, Myah.
Thanks for having me on.
Next, we welcome Priscilla Alvarez, a correspondent covering the White House for CNN. Priscilla has also covered immigration politics and policy and was part of the team nominated for an Emmy for CNN's coverage of Haitian migrants converging at the border. She was previously assistant editor at The Atlantic. So welcome to the podcast, Priscilla.
Good to be with you.
Finally, we welcome Marianne LeVine, who is a national political reporter for The Washington Post. Marianne joined the Post in April 2023 after more than 8 years at Politico. She has previously written about the lobbying industry and labor policy. So welcome, Marianne.
Thanks for having me.
So before we started recording, I said that these episodes are my favorite because I get to turn the tables on the reporters that call me all the time for my thoughts and ask you your thoughts. You all have followed this last election. Some of you covered the last election. You've all covered immigration in part or in total for many years. In your perspective, from each of you, how prominently did immigration issues feature in the presidential and congressional campaigns this year? And for those of you who worked in previous campaigns, how did it differ from any of those previous campaigns? Who wants to go first?
Well, I covered the Harris campaign. I was following her around the country, and it was interesting to see how border security was really resonating with voters, both at her rallies and as my colleagues were reporting on the Trump rallies with them as well. They were a different tone, but she did a stop along the U.S. southern border to speak quite forcefully on immigration, which was a striking move given the position of the administration over the last 4 years, but also the way Democrats have typically handled this issue, which was to briefly touch on it and then quickly pivot to other issues, be it healthcare or the economy. And having covered this administration from the White House lens and bringing with it the time that I had covered immigration, I think that the pivotal moment really over the last 4 years, and I hear this from my own sources, was Texas Governor Greg Abbott transporting migrants to Democratic-led cities across the country, which essentially brought this border crisis forefront to so many Americans that perhaps only thought of it as a U.S. southern border problem. But that alone just really upped the ante, and it was striking traveling the country and hearing from voters in the Northeast or in the Midwest who were suddenly very aware of what was happening along the border. And that's not to say that they weren't before, but it was just something that they were hearing from Democratic mayors, from Democratic governors, and it shaped the conversation in a way over the course of those years and then in the presidential campaign that I'm not sure we would have seen had that not happened. And it was just so different from anything we'd ever seen before. So the sort of unprecedented nature of that combined with the challenges along the border, which were very real for this administration over the last 4 years, really culminated on the campaign trail. And it required Democrats to have to talk about it in a way that they typically just didn't do.
Yeah, I would just say that, there were a lot of people who said that, Governor Abbott was doing this as a political stunt, but it worked. And what you're saying is, yes, he said, I want to bring this issue home to those Democratic strongholds, and it did. Myah or Marianne, how was your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Priscilla really captured that dynamic well. I also covered the Harris campaign, but I watched a ton of Trump rallies, and as we all know, like this was his favorite thing to talk about. He spent a great deal of time, at the start of every rally, really hammering on the immigration issue. And then to Priscilla's point, we saw Biden and then Harris, really trying to find ways to go on offense, to blame Trump for killing that bipartisan border deal earlier this year, running on this idea that Democrats, they want to be tough on border security, but then they also want to keep families together, which was, really this way to kind of try to target Trump for some of his more controversial policies from Trump 1, like family separation. But I mean, at the end of the day, the reality was that they were really playing catch up. And you see that in the data, after the election. I was talking to Immigration Hub recently, and, they're one of the pro immigration groups. And, they've launched this new political arm to kind of try to get ahead of this in future cycles. And a data point that really stood out to me is, they were using data from Ad Impact, and Republicans outspent Democrats, 5-1 in broadcast ads on this issue. And so they were really successful as, framing immigration as this national threat. We heard this from Trump. We heard this from Republicans, down the ballot as well. They really amplified these ideas that, have been debunked by the data, that immigrants are committing all of these crimes. They talked a lot about invasions and Biden and Harris and having these open border policies, and all of that ultimately broke through.
Mm-hmm. Marianne, what's your perspective on this one?
Yeah, so I covered Trump for the Washington Post. So I heard a lot about immigration over the last year or so. And it felt like what's interesting about Trump is he's always made immigration a pretty central part of his platform, going back to his first 2016 presidential campaign where he ran on building the border wall. And so this sort of felt like the next chapter. But I felt like he was really able to tap into the sentiment that people were feeling about and that he was perpetuating about the border being out of control. Often he would make these false statements about people coming to the border from insane asylums or mental institutions, statements that obviously there's no truth to that or there's no evidence of that, but that when I talked to voters at his rallies or at his events, they would echo a lot of those remarks that he would say. Saying that people were coming in from mental institutions. And so I think that he really was able to capture the anxiety people felt about the border. And I think one thing about immigration that I think partly makes it a potent topic is people can see images of the border in ways that they can't see images of other policy areas. And so I think he really tapped into the sense of fear. And I think one thing that kind of stood out to me when I talked to voters too was even in people who are not in border states, sort of to Priscilla's point, would still talk about the border and still talk about their fears of crime. And I think Trump, one line that he often said that stood out to me was he would often say, the issue of people say the economy is the most important issue, but I think immigration is the top issue for voters. And I think it was definitely a top issue for the Republican voters and like his base, especially. I think that's one thing that's really important to clarify, but that is a message that he very much leaned into. And it was the policy area that he leaned into the most. And I think likely helped him win the election in terms of speaking to his base and speaking to concerns that people were having.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way he would link. I mean, polls also showed that voters were also very concerned about the economy, about inflation, about housing prices, about jobs, and he would link immigration to all of those, right? He said that the deportation will help with the housing crisis and that immigrants are perpetuating the crime. And so like just kind of taking all of those top issues and pulling them together probably was pretty potent for him with voters. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think one thing that was interesting was he often used statements that were there was again not much evidence for, but saying in his efforts to appeal to Black and Latino voters, especially, he would often say, they're taking your jobs. They're like these undocumented migrants are taking your jobs. And I think he ended up, that was one of his go-to lines during the campaign. And so I think he used it as a way to actually appeal to other minority groups in the United States to say, like, you guys came here legally, or other groups that he was trying to make inroads with, especially with Black voters, where he would essentially try to paint undocumented immigrants as a threat to their livelihood or job opportunities.
But in many ways, too, I think this was a culmination of the last several years where Republicans
Mhm.
did control the narrative on
Yeah.
this very issue. If you remember, and Maya and Marianne, I'm sure do, the beginning months of the Biden administration were in part defined by a border crisis. There were unaccompanied children who were coming across the border in record numbers. And the position by the White House was to, yes, address it, but not really dive into it. That created a void that Republicans quickly filled. Even an assignment like addressing root causes that the president gave to the vice president was her becoming the border czar. And there wasn't a lot of correcting there so much as just dismissing it as a Republican criticism that was not based in fact. And so what happened in the presidential election was that all of these arguments built on one another. And suddenly, voters, their thoughts on immigration were pretty baked. I mean, with President Joe Biden, who was a Democratic nominee before he dropped out, there was a lot of disapproval among voters, according to the data, about his handling on immigration and border security. The Harris campaign and Harris campaign officials would take note that she was able to drive that down a little bit, but all the same, voters were pretty much already decided on how they felt about this administration and this nominee and Democrats in general on this issue that was so top of mind for so many people.
Yeah, I remember very clearly in the first months of 2021 the loud debate and attempts to get anyone in the administration to call what was happening at the border a crisis. There was like, well, if
Yeah.
it's not a crisis, what is it? And they were refused to use the word. And so there was this whole like just about whether or not that's the right word to use. And I think that probably hurt too. If people can see what's obviously there and you're not willing to call it that, then that's problematic too, I think, in some ways. Myah, what's your thoughts on how this played out with different demographics or in these different ways?
Yeah, I mean, one thing just that you and Marianne were talking about this issue touching so many things, and just something that popped in my head, like even when the hurricane hit, like
Mhm.
immigration was touching that issue, and there was all this, concern about FEMA money and where it was going to these cities, and you saw a lot of false information being shared on social media. So I mean, no matter what the issue was, Trump found a way to really tie it to immigration. And, on different demographic groups, I was thinking about this earlier today. And I mean, no, one demographic is a monolith. So we have to remember that, of course, when we're
Yeah,
talking
absolutely.
about, different voters and the shift. One group that has obviously been really interesting are Latino voters in the shift. And we have to remember a lot of this comes down to the economy and high prices. That was a top concern, across the board for voters. But that being said, we did see a shift among that voting bloc, and immigration did rank as a top concern. And when you dig into it, Latino voters, they don't like this idea of mass deportations and what that could mean. But they also want border security, and it kind of reflects the kind of tightrope Democrats have been trying to walk, and the message that they've been trying to get across over this last year of trying to do both, showing that they're tough on border, but they also aren't going to demonize immigrants. And there's this feeling now as everyone kind of unpacks what happened that, and just talking to some Democrats even this week about this, that, there needs to be some more clarity in that message. And, they're really at this point right now where they have to figure out, okay, going into Trump 2.0, what is that resistance going to look like? What is that message? And,
Or is it
even
going to
who
be a
are those?
resistance? Are they going to use that
Right,
word?
right. Are they even going to use that word?
Yeah.
Even like when it comes down to sanctuary cities, you can already see that kind of divide emerging. Some really kind of embracing that that phrase, others kind of shying away from it. It's just going to look a lot different than 2017.
you kind of alluded to, this campaign had a lot of firsts. For the first time, a National Party candidate bowed out after clinching the nomination. We also had a former president running to take back the office, which has only happened one time before. Um, let's talk about the first issue on the Democratic side. President Biden stepped away from reelection, and Harris had a shortened campaign. This is a little bit of what if. Do you think the issue might have played out differently if there was a more robust Democratic primary? We had a huge Democratic primary in 2020 that came down to President Biden. And this time it was almost the opposite. Biden had clinched it very, very quickly. There was very few candidates in the Democratic primary. And then Harris was handed the nomination after he bowed out. Do you think if the Democrats had had a chance to kind of work on these things on immigration, these messages in a primary campaign, it would have helped? Or do you think it would have made it more confusing for voters?
I feel like it's hard to look back and to know what could have happened. I mean, I think the issue is this was going to be a weak point for any Democrat who was going to have the nomination. I think that obviously Harris had a little bit of a tougher time because of the Border Czar title that she became associated with, largely because of Republicans. But I think that the challenge at the end of the day was that Trump could still say that there were record border crossings under the Biden administration. And I think
And that's not false information. That's correct.
yeah, exactly. It's true. And so I think he could still say that. And I think Democrats just broadly didn't quite have a message as a party or a strategy as a party for how to counter that. And I think that it would have been really difficult for any Democratic candidate to have this issue be a positive for them, just given the record of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, yes, I think another candidate could have potentially benefited from not having, to be as tied to Biden. Harris did kind of have to deal with that, borders are framing, but I'm completely with Marianne that, the party was really, this was the first year in a really long time that it felt like the party had kind of coalesced around a message after the collapse of the bipartisan border deal, but it was really too late. And I think it goes back to that data that I kind of laid out at the beginning. I mean, Republicans just by a crazy amount outspent Democrats on this issue, and they're behind. And it's not just something that they could have made up for in 1 year.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about, what Biden said on immigration versus what Harris said on immigration. In the months that he was running, did any of you see any kind of major distinction or differences between how Biden was talking about the issue than how Harris was?
I mean, I think it certainly evolved over time. I was with the president when he went to the Texas-Mexico border. He was there at the same time that Donald Trump was there. It was this striking image of both of them on the border, both with their narrative of the border presenting at nearly the exact same time, which if you had told me that was going to happen even a year or two ago, I would have thought, no way, because of the posture of the White House, which was not to play in this sandbox with Republicans. But the president was quite forceful when he delivered his address at a Border Patrol station, again on border security and looking at it through specifically the lens of border security. He had briefings there with law enforcement. When the vice president did her address in Arizona, that's when she said that she would go further than President Joe Biden on this issue. By then, however, we had already had the executive order when it comes to restricting asylum along the U.S. southern border. So she had a little bit more to go off on. At the time, President Joe Biden was speaking mostly about the bipartisan border deal and Donald Trump scuttling that deal. But the two of them tried to go on the offensive, and the vice president went on the offensive even within the first week of her having the nomination and putting out a digital video using her time as AG to shore up her credibility on this issue. So the times that they were talking about it were just a little bit different given the circumstances.
Right.
The vice president, however, she said she'd go further than President Joe Biden, but she never dismissed what he did or suggest that there was any level of regret over the way they handled the issue. So by and large, the two of them were pretty on the same footing. But the idea that Maya keeps coming back to, which is absolutely true, is that all of it came too little too late, because by then there had been multiple crises that people had witnessed, and while witnessing that, saw a White House that wasn't willing to call it what it was. So their offensive came in the final months of the presidential election, and that I think did them some harm, again, with voters who already saw them to have been perhaps, or appeared to be, dismissive on it.
Yeah. Let's turn over to the Trump side of this, because he was president before. And so you would reasonably expect him to say, I'm going to do what I did before. But he did say he had to come up with something big. This is Trump, right? He's got it. Last time it was the big, beautiful wall. This time he landed on mass deportations. Marianne, covering this, I mean, we saw the signs in all of his rallies. He still talked about the wall, but that always took sort of second tier. He talked a little bit about revisiting the greatest hits from Trump 1.0, if you will. When and how did this kind of start? He started talking about it. Did it catch on right away? Was it something that a lot of people supported? I saw a lot of polling later, like, oh, actually, people are okay with this. What was your sense following the Trump campaign on how that came about and how it landed?
It's interesting that you brought up the wall, because we actually did a story early during the campaign about how he was talking not as much about the border wall as he used to. And I think that message is a little bit complicated for him, because at the end of the day, he didn't, quote unquote, like, finish the wall. And so it seemed
And Mexico
it's
didn't pay. And
yeah, and Mexico didn't pay for it. And so I think that was kind of a little bit of a complicated message, because
yeah,
finishing the wall sounds less persuasive sometimes probably than building the wall. But he was talking about mass deportations pretty early on in his campaign. I mean, I began covering him last year in October, and it felt like it was already a pretty big part of his stump speech. So it feels like he talked about it pretty consistently throughout his campaign. I think it's also worth noting, though, that he also campaigned on mass deportations the last time he ran for president. So this was another campaign promise that he had made, and it was not something that he was able to execute in the end. But I think it was something that he definitely made much more central to his platform this time. And it felt like a message that resonated very much with his, at least with his base of supporters. And with, when we would talk to voters, a lot of them would say, well, these people are criminals, and why would anyone be against deporting them or sending them back to their country? But and again, obviously, statistics show that there's not much evidence that undocumented immigrants commit more crimes, but this was something that they often heard from Trump. And so it felt like very early on he was leaning into that idea. And I feel like it's a phrase that he can just summarize in like 2 sentences. And I feel like that's a very Trumpian way of going about policy, where it's an image that people can have. And I think it's very much in line with how he campaigns, just generally off of slogans.
We've said this on this podcast a few times. There's an old adage in Washington, D.C. that if you have a bumper sticker slogan, you win over the guy who has to have a paragraph to explain the nuance of the policy issue. And I think that maybe is one way of encapsulating how the two sides kind of looked at it. And from what Myah and Priscilla said, it sounds like you thought that Democrats never landed on that bumper sticker slogan on this issue at all. Let's move to the congressional elections. And I know you mostly are White House reporters, so maybe this is more for some others. But, to what extent was it your perception or from your colleagues that congressional candidates aligned with their presidential candidates on these issues or differed? There's some notable instances of Democrats winning in Trump territory, some of them along the U.S.-Mexico border. And they tended to be very clear about their differences on this issue with the president and with where Harris was. And I think, maybe there are a few Republicans who won in Biden districts as well. There are some, but by and large, did you feel like the parties kind of got in line with where the top of the ticket was?
I mean, I think so. And I think we saw this, in places that were far from the border too. Republicans, we saw them really digging in on this issue to hit at their opponents, like I said, even in places that were nowhere near the border. And I think back to a piece that my colleague did, Nick Wu, and he was writing about Don Davis in North Carolina, and this Republican who was running against him is like, she was out there saying, the border is her top priority, constantly bringing it up to attack Davis. And, he was kind of trying to, do what Harris did, go on the offensive. We saw him running ads. He was touting his own visits to the border and votes in Congress about, favoring increased border security. And so it was a similar playbook. And I think it's one, too, that, you talk to Democrats, you talk to White House officials, a lot of them point to the strategy that Tom Suozzi used in New York in his special election, and the fact that he was out there really early, not shying away from the issue as Democrats have often done in the past, being very aggressive. And, White House officials, Democrats running, they would tell you they were really trying to mimic that in a lot of ways.
But the difference, too, that was also striking about Swazi was a willingness to essentially embrace tougher restrictions, which the party had generally not been doing, especially after the first Trump term. The family separation and so many of the controversial moves that Donald Trump did on the border really, I saw this both with Democrats, but also in the immigrant advocacy space, moved far further to the left. Again, coming off of that first term, and then what I think we were seeing happen over the last year is Democrats trying to move back to the center on this issue and show again a willingness to do more restrictions. And the bipartisan border bill that we've been citing here a couple of times is the perfect example of that. This bill that was being worked on by Democrats and Republicans made no mention of the undocumented immigrants who were brought here as children, known as dreamers. That omission in and of itself told you everything you needed to know about how the Democratic Party was trying to reposition itself to be competitive with Republicans on this narrative. And that, I think, we started to see with the top of the ticket and also congressional races, and then trying to be more forceful on the issue and show that not only that it wasn't just Republicans that were willing to be tough, Democrats could be tough too. And that reshaping of the argument has been interesting to watch, and it's one we're going to continue to watch over the next several months and years, I think.
Yeah. Marianne, from your perspective, did you see a lot of Republicans sort of just line up behind Trump, or were there some that were willing to kind of be a step away?
It felt like on immigration, on this issue especially, Republicans were pretty in line with Trump. I think they sort of felt like this was a winning issue for them, and I think that they were pretty much aligned with him and with his opposition to the bipartisan border deal. I think a lot of them really did follow his lead, and so they maybe didn't use the same type of rhetoric or language that he would use in terms of talking about undocumented immigrants. But I think they very much followed his lead in terms of just saying that the border was out of control and that it needed to be taken under control, and that they needed to be tougher. I mean, I think it was interesting just to see like the evolution of certain senators on this issue. Like Marco Rubio, for example, was someone who was not up for reelection, but he was someone who was a very close Trump surrogate, and he had worked on the bipartisan immigration deal many years ago.
2013,
and then,
I was there.
Yeah,
I remember
2013.
it.
Yeah,
I
and
remember
it was just,
S744. Remember those days? Part of the Gang of Eight.
Yeah, and it was just like I feel like it was fascinating talking to him in the sense of like looking at like the evolution of I feel like he's a good encapsulation of the party just generally. But I think that he was someone, for example, earlier this year who voted against a huge aid package, a foreign aid package for Ukraine and Israel, and cited the border as the reason for that. So I feel like the issue really permeated the Republican Party on so many levels, and it felt like there was not a lot of daylight between congressional Republicans and Trump on this.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me looking back, say, to 2020 when Biden really did run. I'm going to do 180 degrees opposite of what Trump did on immigration. I'm going to undo everything. And he won a trifecta in 2020. And they tried to push through a bunch of stuff on reconciliation. It didn't happen. We saw huge increases in immigration at the border. Now Trump has won and has the trifecta in Washington. And guess what? We're talking reconciliation again. But what strikes me is that both times the majorities are not that big. And in the midterms, they lost the trifecta. Is it your sense, covering the politics of this issue in particular, that post-electoral consequences, particularly when one party's in charge, people tend to kind of go big and then not get what they want. Is that helping or hurting the potential for people to find common ground?
There are just so many competing interests. Everyone has their constituencies. We'll see it, I think, in the reconciliation process with districts with ag and where they draw the line on certain. I mean, for example, E-Verify is a great example of that. Look at the lawmakers who have been totally behind it and the ones that are privately not wanting it. I think this issue will often involve so many different parties because immigration does touch almost everything.
Yeah.
And it has become increasingly difficult for there to be any consensus. I mean, again, looking at that bipartisan border bill, Langford was the one working on it. This was something that, by and large, if those measures had been put into legislation and had passed, would have been remarkable. I mean, that would have completely changed the way that the U.S. immigration system has been operating in modern history. So all of that to say that even on something that generally would have some consensus, it doesn't. I do think it'll be interesting to see what Democrats do. Again, they are recalibrating their message. Whether they decide to side with some Republicans and help them push something through, I think will be fascinating to watch. It was something that they tried multiple times. Republicans did in Trump's first term. Or if you all recall, there was the deal making about the border wall money with Pelosi, and none of that came to fruition. So it will be interesting to see if the part of the outcome of this election is whether Democrats are willing to play ball on some of this legislation that Republicans will bring forward or through the reconciliation process. But having covered this for years, like all of you, I have not been able to cover any type of comprehensive immigration reform that has passed. And that has just been the reality for more than a decade. And I will also note that Donald Trump has said recently in an interview that he'd be willing to work with Democrats to find a solution for those dreamers, those undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children. Again, whether or not that happens, unclear. There usually is bipartisan support, but once lawmakers add multiple different things to these bills, they tank. So I think that this political moment will be just perhaps a little more unique than previous ones in how lawmakers decide to work together or not. But I think everyone can agree that there needs to be some change to the immigration system. It is quite outdated. Whether or not it can happen in this trifecta is still a big question.
Marianne or Myah, any comments on what the
Yeah, I
governments might
mean,
look at?
I was going to bring up the DACA thing too, because it was just interesting kind of how Democrats took that. I think there was a lot of, we have to wait and see. Maybe there's some room for compromise, but there was a lot of eye rolling, I think, among Democrats that, this feeling of, okay, he's floating this, but also in the same breath as these other things like, his intent to end birthright citizenship, in the same breath. And so they don't see that necessarily as super promising in terms of finding compromise on the issue.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I mean, one area that I'll be interested in looking at from Congress is how much money is appropriated for border security, and also, I mean, if Trump really
And
does
for the
want to do
deportation campaign,
yeah,
right?
exactly, right. Like I think that if Trump really does want to do mass deportations in the way that in the scale at which he's talked about it on the campaign trail, that's going to require significant more financial resources. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how the appropriations processes kind of play out in the next couple months in terms of how much money is allocated to DHS and how much money does any money really go towards mass deportation. So I think that's one area that I'll definitely be watching. But I agree with Priscilla's assessment of the likelihood of reform of comprehensive immigration reform, or just like the history of the challenges, I should say, of that going forward. The other thing that I think that I'm sort of keeping an eye out on is in the last few months, border crossings have gone down because of more restrictions that the Biden administration has put in place. And so I'm really curious, as a political reporter, just generally, if people's views of the border change and if those reduced crossings coincide with the issue being less potent, maybe in terms of the border, because maybe Trump comes in and says, look, border crossings are down, and takes credit for it. And so I think that that's one. I'm curious about the potency of the issue with the decline in border crossings, and how does that impact how voters actually feel about it, or is this really about messaging and how that message gets through to them in the next few months?
I'll be following that too, because, it's very interesting that they're down now, in part because of the measures that the Biden administration put in, part because Mexico's doing a lot more. Trump has threatened Mexico. Mexico's saying, well, if you threaten us, we don't have to keep doing what we're doing. And so I think there's a lot of dynamics, and those numbers could go up or down. I think, we have to see how that plays out. The money is really interesting to me, because I remember when Trump was president before, I believe it was Republicans who wouldn't give him all the money he wanted for the border wall. And so he ended up shutting the government down for the longest time ever to get money for the border wall. And he only relented when somebody told him, you can declare a national emergency and take money from other parts of the government, which he did. I can see that happening, but eventually Congress has to fill in those holes wherever he's taking them. So they're going to have to talk money. They're already talking money now. But it's unclear how much they're going to be able to settle on, because they also are trying to see if they can reduce the deficit and, pay for a big tax bill that they want to do. All of which is to say, we probably have a lot of things to look forward in 2025, but amongst them is confirmations. So we have a few people that he has nominated for key roles for this. Obviously, Tom Homan has not been named for a Senate confirmed role. He's going to be working out of the White House. People claim that Harris was the border czar, but Tom is actually the border czar for Trump. And then Governor Kristi Noem from North Dakota as DHS secretary, which probably is one of the hardest jobs in Washington to do. I don't envy anybody who would be in that role ever, no matter what party. We heard just this last week, I think, Rodney Scott for Customs and Border Protection and Caleb Vitello for ICE. I'm not sure that I've heard anybody for USCIS. All of those positions, other than Tom Homan's, do have to be Senate confirmed. It doesn't take more than a majority to do that. Do you see issues with any of them, like the discussions about them, how that process might play out? And, we're always seeing right now Trump is trying to lean on some of the senators from some of his other nominees. What's your sense about how that's going to go?
What I have found interesting about the picks in the immigration space, and I'm going to put Kristi Noem aside here, but more so at the component level and then with Tom Homan, is so much of Trump's brand is to be a disruptor and to pick loyalists and to change the way that Washington works. Kash Patel at FBI, many others. What has been interesting in this space, however, is that these are veterans. These are people who have been in these roles, or similar roles, I should say, or just veterans of the agency. Rodney Scott has been around for a long time. Caleb, same thing. Tom, certainly.
They all had
know
full careers in the
full
agencies they're being
careers.
named for
They
now.
are
Yeah.
law enforcement guys. And that wasn't always the case with the first term. But I think that they do bring a seriousness to this agenda, because they are people who do get it. And I have talked to current and former Homeland Security officials, and they also do have quite a bit of respect. Even Tom Homan, with some of his pronouncements and statements, there are people who know him at a personal level and have a level of confidence in the fact that he knows operationally how these things work. Kristi Noem, I remember as soon as she was announced, I was texting sources and they were like, well, she was a governor. Like this may not be so bad. Like she ran a state. So maybe she can just slide into this role. I think the bar was so
There
low.
have been governors that have been head of DHS before.
Yeah. And also I think it was 5 Homeland Security secretaries under Trump's first term.
Yeah, between only one confirmed and a bunch of
Yes, exactly. So
acting.
there was so much
kind of
shuffling.
acting.
Yeah, that now there is a little more confidence that maybe there will be stability. And it's so clear that immigration will come from the White House with Miller and Homan, that Kristi Noem will obviously play some role in that, but perhaps not maybe this is a remains to be seen, have the pressures of rolling out the immigration policy in the same ways that some of the other secretaries had. All the
Mhm.
same, she is the face of it and she is the head of the department. But a lot of decisions are so clearly going to be made by Tom and by Stephen Miller. So I just think that it's unique the way that they have approached the immigration picks
Mhm.
versus the way that we are seeing in some other departments like RFK, Junior, and HHS, et cetera. There is, I think, with this, you do have to sort of take Trump at his word that they are trying to do something here. What that looks like, there are still questions around, but the people that they're putting in these posts do understand
They're the
how
ones who would
these
know how to
agencies
do it if you're gonna do it,
correct.
is what I would say, yeah. Maya, Marianne, any thoughts from you on the confirmation process and the picks we've got so far?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I think it's so true. I mean, immigration policy is going to be incredibly centralized in the White House. And I think because of some of the controversy swirling around some of the other nominees, the immigration picks like really haven't, and some of them are fresh too, but, really have not been as under scrutiny as some of the others. And so we'll have to wait and see because it does seem like the way this is, we have quite some time. And we'll have to kind of see how this goes. It does seem in some ways it's been kind of going one at a time in terms of who's kind of in the hot seat. So we'll see if that, pivots to one of these roles in the immigration space. But right now, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case.
And I think just real quick, regardless, what Maya was saying reminded me, regardless of party, these agencies haven't had confirmed picks for.
No,
I mean, ICE hasn't had someone in it
since
who was
Obama.
confirmed since Obama, exactly. And so there's been these agencies have been operating under and acting for so long that regardless of whether you agree with this administration or not, almost everyone that you talk to in these agencies would love to see a Senate confirmed leader because that does change the tenor of the agency and the leadership.
Absolutely. All right. So looking forward to 2025, once we get past some of these initial things, what are the big sort of immigration political stories you're looking for out of the White House, out of Congress that you're going to be trying to follow?
I mean, two things that I'm thinking about. One, we've kind of talked about, but like, where does the Democratic Party go on this next? What does their response look like to Trump 2.0 and his policies? And then, secondly, I mean, this question of, mass deportations, we've talked about the funding element. There are so many challenges to implementing a policy of this scale. And I'm very curious what that's going to actually look like, just in terms of having the officials they would need to implement this, the funding, like we've talked about. There are just so many challenges that we're going to kind of see play out. And, I'm very curious, does it reach the scale that he talked about on the campaign trail? Does this become kind of like the wall 2.0, where it doesn't necessarily live up to the promise? And then there's the question too of, does that even matter? Because with the wall, he was able to convince voters and his base, and that he was tough on immigration and tough on the border. And so I'm just very interested in terms of like how that policy is actually implemented and how it pans out.
Piggybacking off of Maya in the Democratic space, I think the first, in addition to the reconciliation process and some of what's going to be presented on the floor in Congress, how Democratic governors respond, I think will start to give us clues into the ways that the Democratic Party is positioning itself on this issue. Because when you talk about interior enforcement, it touches the entire country. This is not just a southern border. So, how each of these states responds and the way that they do so, whether there are some things that they are willing to give on, others where they won't, or maybe they don't at all. I think that will start to give us a good glimpse into how the Democratic Party is positioning itself. I think the other thing that I'll be watching for is the approach to the Western Hemisphere and how they strategize with countries to take those who they're trying to repatriate, how they do the carrot and stick approach with the tariffs with Mexico, with Canada. There has been more attention paid to the Western Hemisphere under the Biden administration because this issue, as you all know, has gone well beyond the Northern Triangle. And so the first time around was quite scattershot. I recently did a story about how his transition team is strategizing and really thinking through how they approach the Western Hemisphere, which countries they are paying particular attention to, where they see opportunity, where they see challenge. So I do think that that is going to be a very interesting storyline in the way that they navigate the politics of the region, and of course, how that affects his own implementation of his plans.
Yeah. Marianne, what about you? What are you going to try to follow in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Myah that obviously the enactment of mass deportations or the attempt to enact that policy will be really fascinating to watch, and especially to see like what the impact is politically if he does in fact really start to crack down not just on sending people back who have committed crimes, but really trying to broaden the scope of what that operation would look like, which I think would be very challenging and hard. But seeing what the impact of that would be in terms of policy, and also in terms of like people's perception of the policy as time goes on. So I think that's one area I'm looking at, and I think the other area I'm interested too in is looking at legal immigration. I feel like we talk a lot about how Trump talks about undocumented immigrants, how he would approach undocumented immigrants. But I'm really interested to see, for example, does the public charge rule come back? Does he try to curb legal immigration in the way that he did during his first term? He didn't do it especially effectively, but I'm curious, especially with Stephen Miller in the White House, how that how that kind of plays out at the agency level. And then and then finally, I think looking broadly at what the political implications are of this issue and kind of how it evolves over time with Trump now in the White House. Do people's perception of the issues changed, and how does that compare with the data that we're going to see are all some of the areas that I'll be watching for next year.
Yeah, the legal immigration question is a very interesting one for me because Trump sometimes talks very positively. I mean, about, we want people to come legally. And yet there are other people in his orbit that talk differently about it. He's surrounding himself right now with a lot of tech people who are telling him we need more immigrants in certain key areas. But he's got other people in his orbit who would prefer to see less immigrants anywhere. We should have homegrown tech talent. So I personally, and maybe this is for you all to tip, how did these dynamics play out amongst the people in Trump's orbit, and where does that policy end up at the end of the day when it comes to legal immigration? To me, that's the kind of maybe one piece we have the least understanding of how it's all going to settle out on.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the key question there is the who. I don't think that it's about not wanting anyone to come here legally. It's who they want. There was a big push the first time around for merit immigration-based system. So I think it's this time around, the question is going to be who exactly do you think should be able to come here legally and who shouldn't be?
And whether or not they are going to be able to manage to leverage anything through a very tightly divided Congress. Well, thank you so much, ladies, Marianne, Myah, Priscilla. We will look forward to eagerly reading and listening to all of your coverage over the next year. I'm sure you'll be calling me at some point, but I very much enjoyed this opportunity to interview you today. So thank you so much for coming on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. We'll be taking a holiday break, and we'll be back with you in 2025 with new episodes. In the meantime, one last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. And you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you in the new year on This Week in Immigration.